Okay, I'm not getting any responses in the chat box, so I'm going to hope that everyone can hear me, and hope that somebody will say if they can't, if I'm not loud enough. So to introduce myself, I'm Sally MacAndrew, the ADOS and Young Learner Coordinator for IH Riga Sadfa. I took on the role 3 years ago, and one of my main responsibilities was to manage and teach our project-based courses. And this is what I've been doing pretty much every day ever since. I'm going to make a couple of assumptions. Since you're attending a webinar all about projects, I'm not going to talk about the benefits at great length. Just to say that watching some of my students grow over the past 3 years, I believe that projects do have a lot of sort of positive points in them, and that they do help our students to grow and change, both as English speakers, but also as, young people who are growing up into a very interesting world. The obvious ones are that they do teach young learners a measure of independence, and they often give a more in-depth look at an interesting topic. It's quite possible that children will be studying things that don't come up in the school curriculum, and it allows us to give them a little bit of a chance to look at a wider world. Projects also use a lot more flexible use of language. They can give children the chance to sort of springboard out of basic grammar into using language for a very real purpose, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. They're also usually pretty motivating, and they're very enjoyable and interesting. And the more confident you become in organizing projects for your learners, the more fun you get to have and they get to have, and the more interesting topics you're willing to take on. So if that's understood, why don't we do projects all the time? Why do we sort of stick to textbooks? What I'd like you to do is, in the chat box, I'd like you to put in some of the problems that you feel you face with running projects, and hopefully I'll talk about some of those, and if there's time at the end we can talk about any that I'm not going to talk about. So if you could pop those messages into the chat box so that we can see if you have different problems with projects to the ones I am going to talk about now. One of the sort of initial problems that we have with projects is problems with the concept. Students often say, "Oh no, I hate them, I don't want to do them." So one solution is simply never call anything a project. Don't use the word. Trick them into working on an extended topic out of pure interest. We're going to talk a little bit later about my animal book, which is a project that I do with 5- and 6-year-olds. But for example, with teenagers, we talked about misunderstood animals, which was in fact springboarded from the course book, and we ended up creating Facebook memes, which we published, and you can see those on the IH Riga website, our Facebook website, if you're interested in looking. We also have done projects recently about, for example, Saxon Britain with 9- and 11-year-olds. And my perennial favourite is working on our storybook, whatever the storybook happens to be, whether it's a picture book for very young learners, or whether it's something from Sherlock Holmes for older learners, or Agatha Christie was a particularly popular one that people enjoyed. So, another problem that we often have to face is problems with logistics. One of the biggest issues is that students get bored with some of the necessary stages, and then they don't do that properly because they want to do the next thing, which looks much more fun and interesting. This is more of an issue the first time you do a project. Once they've messed up and had to repeat a couple of times, students will tend to realize, and they will start to trust you, which of course can be a valuable life lesson about doing your proper preparation. But it is worth impressing on students that there are consequences to not doing this stage correctly, and that, the secondary stage will actually be more important, and that they need to get this right because moving on is not possible without it. One of the sort of perennial teacher problems is early finishers versus slow coaches. There's always the child that never gets caught up with the others, and there's always the one who's much ahead of everybody else and doing much better. And this is where projects are brilliant. Your quickest students can be doing a much more complex version, or they can be adding more information, while weaker ones can have a bit more one-to-one support from you. And if you are setting up projects to help children to work a bit more independently, that does free you in class to go and spend time with those students who are struggling and to help them to complete the stages. What we then need to do is, when we're planning our projects, is actually build a little bit of flexibility into the activities to support that. And we'll talk about that in a little as well. The last two I find are very much tied up together. In IH Riga, we sort of have a consistent issue with students being absent through sickness, or attending class activities at school and this sort of thing. What I actually do to solve this is I give each student at the beginning of the project a plastic wallet to put everything in, and then everything goes in that. So nothing goes home until the end of the project. At each stage, if we're doing something with a worksheet, or if we're doing something where we're making something, I always end up making 2 or 3 while I demonstrate, and I just tuck those into the file of the missing students, so that when they come next time, a half-made one is already there for them. We don't have to keep kind of going back and panicking about what's been missed out. So if we accept that logistics and organisation are sort of 2 of the problems that we can solve, let's think about the problems which we really can't get away with projects without solving. The 2 biggest problems that I think we forget about when we're planning but become very real when we're running them are language production. And I like to call this, what is the point? Because at the end of the day, what we want is language production. What we want is good English coming out. So this is important. If you're not working on language, what's the point of doing it in the first place? So when planning your project, you do need to consider at every stage what the language you're going to be practicing is. You might be doing a project on healthy eating, so your language point is should, shouldn't, or how much, how many. We've done a project recently on temperature, and our language there was comparatives. So there's an intrinsic grammatical language point in the project at each stage, and it could only be a very short part of that project, or it could be much larger. There are also going to be functional language issues, places where you need to add in what they need to be able to complete the project. With younger learners, that could be as simple as making sure they can say, can I have something, please? Can I have the scissors, please? With older learners, that might be negotiation language for agreeing who does which part. We had a very interesting project where we created as a class a mythological creature and wrote a legend about it. And it was quite complicated for the students to negotiate to make sure that it definitely had 2 wings and 3 legs, and not 7 wings and 25 legs, because legs were easier to make than wings, which was a bit more difficult. The other thing that I think I've come to the conclusion is very important is an appropriate end product. And I always ask myself the question, okay, why did I bother? And I get the students' responses as well to the question, why did I bother? My go-to is always a booklet, and by keeping everything yourself in the classroom, you have a final session where you assemble all the different worksheets and elements together, staple it together, and create a booklet. I usually put some kind of cover on it to make it look nice, and that's a fairly sort of standard project finish. But there's no reason not to do other things. And in the last 3 years, we've made books, we've made films, we've done a couple of comic books, we've done animated films, posters, cards, etc. These are not complicated to organize. and create something that's quite nice. Certainly the videos, we tend to put them onto Facebook so parents can observe them and watch them wherever they don't actually feature the children. And if you're interested, then do look on our Facebook page, because quite a lot of the English Plus projects are there. So the elephant in the room, and this is the one that always hits us: time. There's two issues with time. There's planning time and there's time in class. We as teachers do not have an awful lot of free time or indeed to do the project in class time. So my sort of recipe for success in projects is baby steps. Don't think of it as planning one massive project. Break it up into a series of much, much smaller things. And that could be as small as, I'm going to do a word search on vegetables, which will then lead to this, which will lead to something else, which will lead to something else. Everything should lead towards the end product, but everything can be a very small step. For yourself, have a plan with everything you need. So you have all your pieces of paper for the students, all your pieces of paper for yourself. You have all your materials at least written down, if not in the box with the plan, but also that you can then scribble on it and work on it to make sure you know what's coming up and what you need to organize. There's no reason for a project to be big. Start small. There's no reason why a project cannot be 15 minutes at the end of a lesson every day for 3 days. This is a very manageable project, and it's a great place to start and see how things will go. It's also much easier to kind of think in terms of 3 15-minute activities, which you glue together at the end, than it is to think of, oh gosh, how am I going to put this huge project together? Another thing that I think is very relevant and very useful for teachers is to always think, whatever materials you're creating, can I adapt them? This is a spider quiz. It was a part of a Halloween project. In fact, it was quite a big chunk of the Halloween project. And you can see in the center, these were the cards, which was the quiz. And I created 8 of these. They took a fair amount of time to put together and to research and to create. And then what I did was I created 2 worksheets, one for 5-year-olds, 5 and 6-year-olds, and one for older students. This particular one was much easier. It's for pre-literate students who are able to read a little bit, but are finding it quite difficult to write. So in this case, they would answer the question, where do spiders live? By putting circles around the correct answers and a nice big cross over the fridge where hopefully no spiders live. You can see on the right-hand side a quiz, which is exactly the same quiz, but it was much more complicated, requiring more writing. And in the case of actually running the lesson, on this side, I helped the students and we worked as a big group doing it together and reading and writing together. In this case, the students were much more independent and worked by themselves. And this one hopefully should be emailed to you so that you can have a look at it and hopefully have a play with it with your own classes. Once we'd completed the quiz and learned some facts about spiders, we then made spider crafts. So on the left-hand side, you can see some spiders where we had talked about the different colors of spiders and researched them. And we created spiders who were made with crepe paper in cut-out shapes and had the right number of eyes and counted the legs and things like that. And that was for the 5-year-olds. For the older students, we learned to do a kirigami web, which is origami, which involves scissors. And then we wrote spider facts and did a little bit more of a web quest so that they could create their own spiders and their own information of what was going on. Finding time in class can be difficult. And again, I keep coming back to this: break things up and break things up into tiny little sections. But if you have done that, then it's much easier to find that little bit of time to do the activity today. And if instead of having a big sort of 2-hour project, you've got 5 or 6 15-minute activities. That's something that you can do every day for a week, and at the end of the week, that can be the completion of the project. Or in a school like mine, where we see our students twice a week, I tend to plan things that will work over a month. The other thing that's relevant to think about and to look at is, if you are trying to kind of steal time from lessons, then have a look and see what you can replace. Replacing the course book is obviously sort of an up and down issue. We often feel that we have to use it. It includes things that the students need to know. But look at your course book and see if your project could be adapted, or use the course book to actually change the way that you're doing it. For example, if a student has to do a writing task in the book, is there any reason why they can't write that particular kind of task within your project? For example, writing a letter about spiders to your mum, something like that, if their problem is that they have to write a letter. Speaking practice, is there any reason they can't do a presentation? Or will the project itself simply involve enough speaking that you can skip some of the speaking practice that's coming up in the book? The other thing that I also really like having is I like using YouTube videos. These are great for finding ways of making things yourselves. So, for example, the Kirigami spider webs were made from a YouTube video. But they're also quite good for students to then watch it. And what I do with older students quite a lot is I show them the video, and then I elicit from them how we're going to do it. Obviously, I need to be very secure and know how it's going to work myself, so that I can help my students to get the instructions right. But them preparing their own instructions can be a really good way for them to see, as I said before, if they don't want to do this stage, that the next stage might not work. But there we go. We can see from our instructions that we must do this right, because then the second part won't go wrong and there won't be too many problems. Okay, so I've talked a lot about generalities, and what I'd like you to do now is to make it a bit more manageable and show you a project which I've been using with 5 and 6-year-olds, and to show you how it built from a small project that was just 3 or 4 lessons into a quite a big 8-week project. And for me, that's 16 lessons of 45 minutes. So I started off by thinking what I had available. Crayons, glue and scissors is always available. And this particular project requires a lot of animal flashcards. It's ideal if you have lots and lots of really unusual animals, much more interesting ones than just the boring ones that come up in our course books. They always seem to focus on tigers and giraffes. So we had all sorts of things like turtles and armadillos and a very strange kangaroo picture. I took my own weighing scales from my bathroom in, and you'll see why we needed those later. I find that tape measures are particularly good in class. They come up as a useful piece of equipment in class all the time. So I do have a few sort of stashed away in my classroom. They're definitely worth investing in. And then the worksheets and an adjective match game, which I will show you. In this particular project, having a 2-story building and a 30-meter corridor available to me was really helpful. In fact, our 30-meter corridor went all the way from the office, round the cafe and into the staff room, but we managed, and that will do nicely. So the project began with what I started calling the mini book. The first couple of lessons are on adjectives which are useful for different animals. We started off with pairs: beautiful, ugly, fast and slow, friendly and dangerous, and tiny and enormous. And we completed this section with drawings and a little bit of writing about the animals that we thought were dangerous or beautiful, and in this case, very interesting. This was 5 and 6-year-olds, so I wanted to give them a boost to the vocabulary they were using. Instead of saying, you know, an elephant is big, let's say an elephant is enormous, and using a bit more interesting vocabulary. We moved on to the second part, which is pets, focusing on I've got, and we talked a lot about pets that are common pets that lots of people have. We then also talked about pets that people in the class had. And what we did for the students who didn't have a pet was we made it imaginary, and they created their own pet, what pet they might like to have. For the final section, we talked about what animals make good pets and what animals don't. And for my part, I always make this a dragon, and I always explain that dragons make excellent pets for firelighting, because that means that students get to be a little bit more imaginative, and we get some more interesting animals coming up here, often mythical, but also you do get the child who has decided that an armadillo would be an excellent pet and they'd really like it. For wild animals, we talked about where do they live. So you can see that we're already on 3 different kinds of grammar over the period of time of this project. And we're talking about where do they live and in what kind of habitat. And this was a more cut and stick kind of project page, where we coloured the different habitats and put them into the correct boxes. And then around the edges, we added animals which live in those habitats and what kinds of animals that we might encounter in our own habitats and in streets and in local areas. The final part of this mini book was that we talked about farm animals, and we talked about where things come from. For example, milk comes from cows, etc., things like that. And this was quite a lot of fun drilling to talk about how things work and where we get our food from. The most fun was when it's milk comes from cows, and then you have cheese comes from milk, comes from cows, and you kind of extend it. Throughout the project, there were 2 songs. This particular song here comes from the Kids Box 1 course book that my students were using. And if anybody is using it, they'll recognize it. My name's Simon, and this is my mouse. It's a small mouse, it's a small mouse. But we rewrote our songs, and we created, I seem to remember, a fast shark. There was a friendly unicorn, and I think my pet was an enormous whale this time around. And again, this is something on Facebook where we made a video of us singing the song and showing our pictures and our writing so that parents could actually see it. The song on the right goes to the tune of Baa Baa Black Sheep, and it was a little more spontaneous, or it's become something I use a little more spontaneously. Obviously, there are verses that I've written for us to sing and practice. Hello, giraffe, have you got long legs? Yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, I have. 2 on the left and 2 on the right. I've got long legs, long, long legs. But what we tend to do is we take those flashcards again and we find an animal and we invent a song on the spot about different parts of the animal's body. It gets a little difficult when they want to talk about tails because you haven't got one on the left and one on the right, but we found different ways to get around that. We moved on to talking about different categories of animals, and one that we focused on was mammals and fish. And we looked at how mammals and fish differ, and also how they are similar. So, for example, mammals live both on land and in the sea, and then fish live on land and in the sea, but obviously fish don't live on land, so we had to put a big cross to make sure that that was changed. Again, this was done in the form of a quiz, so the cards made quiz questions and quiz answers around the room, so that students could go and find out for themselves and find the right answers. And we did quite a lot of it as a group to help students to work by themselves, and to help students work together, where the weaker ones who are not so confident at reading could get each other helping them. This then moved on to talking about whales. Obviously, whales are something that is confusing, whether it's a mammal or a fish, if you're only 5 years old. So we did a sort of deductive test to work out where they live and what kind of blood they have, do they have babies or lay eggs, and came to the conclusion at the end that, of course, they are mammals. And we were able to then look at some of the pictures and see if we could find other animals who were like whales that were unusual. And we had a very interesting conversation about the duck-billed platypus, because of course it lays eggs instead of being having live young, which my 5 and 6 year olds found absolutely fascinating, and they could hardly believe it was a real animal. Having got into talking about whales, we started to work on some language for how big, how tall, how long, and how heavy. This is where we got the measuring tapes out and the scales, and we again had information to look at, and we were looking for keywords like baby or adult, and then looking for long or kilograms to look at the different kinds of measurements. We measured out how big we were, and then we measured out along the corridor the length of a baby whale. In one group, we also measured, as I said before, we measured out the length of an adult blue whale, which took quite a lot of time and was quite complicated, but that's quite a small group, so it was easy to manage. Oh, sorry. And so the second part of that project was that we then weighed ourselves, and we compared our own weight with the weight of a blue whale so that we could balance them out and work out how many classes of us it would take to balance a scale for a blue whale. Moving on, we looked at, from how long and how heavy, we looked at how far and how high. And this was something that was quite a lot of fun, because we looked at measured the jumps of different kinds of animals. We looked at how big they were and how high they could actually jump. For example, a klipspringer, we were able to measure from the ground floor all the way up the stairs to the height a real klipspringer could jump to, and make a display based on that information with a picture that was the correct size, so sort of a blown up photocopy of the animal. And we also were able to compare our own jumps, measuring them to the different animals and seeing how we compared as humans jumping compared with frogs or froghoppers or other animals. I said that I like to kind of finish by adding a cover. So this was in effect a revision lesson involving talking about wild animals, talking about how tall, how long, how heavy, talking about farm animals and adjectives for animals and where they live, all the things that we'd already covered, but something that we kind of reviewed and worked on together and talked about. Booklets are my go-to to finish a project, but recently with other classes, we've been looking at some very different kinds of projects and creating some different things. Posters can often be fun and often work very nicely in concert with a booklet. So the students take home something for themselves, but you also end up with some information which can go up on the wall and can be used as a really nice display. Individual posters like this one, I think I mentioned earlier, we did a project on temperature, and this was quite a fun project, which actually took a couple of lessons to put together, involving, playing games. We played a lot of warmer, cooler and games like that, and created this rather nice little poster, which is currently still on my wall, but will eventually go home with the students. This was a completion of a project on senses, where we talked about different ways of smelling and tasting and touching and finding out information. We did quite a lot of blind tests where you'd close your eyes and smell things that your partner gave you and had to guess what they were. And what we did in the end was we created riddles. Where am I? And we would explain the things we could hear, see, and smell. And in this case, we also added the things we could feel in our emotions as well, which was quite good fun to go with the 5 physical senses. And these are also posted on Facebook so that students can go and look and they can guess the answers to their friends' puzzles. This part is a project on volcanoes, and our final product is actually a model volcano with a sort of mechanical flames coming out of it. We've also done, we had to measure very precisely, so a lot of the project was about taking measurements and being very accurate in what you do with your kind of measuring and beginning stages of the project to bring it all together. So my sort of feeling is that projects require a lot of advanced planning and preparation. You do need to commit the time to them at the beginning. The flip side of that is, of course, if you've done all the preparation and planning at the beginning, you end up with a series of lessons all ready to go, which you then don't need to organize. And all you need to do is have a quick look through to remind yourself of what you're planning to do. So putting the time in at the beginning is definitely worth it and pays off in kind of more time later on and being much more relaxed about doing projects. The projects also, you need to be focusing on your goal and your aim. So thinking about the language, as I've talked about already, and thinking about the product that the student is going to take home, whether that's a booklet or showing their mum a video when they've done it. You also need to look at the staging. And this, again, as I said, is something that you need to think about and be prepared to be flexible on. One of the reasons I like to have projects in very small kind of sections is so that I'm able to change things around if I realize that, oh, actually doing it that way around didn't work as well. If I switch it, I can give them better language to work with and have more interesting things for them to be doing, but also that they will be more confident in working on it. They are hard work. Don't get me wrong, projects do not come easily at the beginning, but they are very popular. They're huge fun for both you and the students, and they're very motivating. A student who is not interested in grammar or reading, or particularly in speaking, can become very excited about learning how to make a cake to a Saxon recipe. They can become very interested in finding out about different animals and learning more about a chosen subject. More importantly, once you've done a couple of projects, both you and your students are going to be a lot more confident about them. And one of the main problems I've found with teachers asking me, how do I start with projects, is you've got to take the plunge. It's chaos, it's messy, and it will probably go wrong at least once. But that isn't a reason not to do it again and go, okay, it went wrong last time, but I'll have another go. Start small and keep notes. As I say, have your plan and scribble on it all the time. Add all the things that you did wrong this time and try not to do them wrong next time, because it is very much worth that amount of fun and the amount of language that you'll get out of it. I'm a non-Russian or Latvian speaker, and my students try very, very hard to explain things to me because they know they have to. And what's really, really helpful is that they will come to me and they will try and figure out how to explain something, even if they don't really have the language yet. And that is a moment in class that I always love, because that shows that my students are learning not just to fill in their grammar book or complete their exercises or pass their exams, but they're learning real communication. And for me, that's very much what I think projects should really be about. Okay, I'm a little bit conscious of the time, so I'm hoping that we're not going to get cut off. My name's Sally, and I'm the ADOS and Young Learner Coordinator at IH Riga Satva. Projects is something I'm very passionate about and I love doing. And so what I'd like to say now is that if anybody would like to send a message in the chat box or switch your microphone on and ask questions, I'm very happy to carry on answering questions until the meeting shuts itself down. Thank you very much. I'll hover here for a couple of minutes. I hope that's been of use to people and enjoyable for you.